Britain's empire, often remembered for its global reach and industrial power, was built on a foundation of exploitation, especially through its deep involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. From the late 1600s to the early 1800s, British merchants and institutions played a leading role in capturing, transporting, and enslaving millions of Africans. At the heart of this system was the Royal African Company, chartered by the monarchy, which established British dominance in West African slave trading. Major port cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and London grew rich as key nodes in the triangular trade. British goods were shipped to Africa, enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas, and raw goods like sugar and cotton were brought back to Britain. The scale was staggering. Over 3 million Africans are estimated to have been transported by British ships alone. The conditions endured by enslaved people during the Middle Passage were horrific. Crammed into overcrowded ships, many died from disease, abuse, or suicide. Those who survived faced brutal lives on Caribbean plantations where backbreaking labor, starvation, violence, and dehumanization were daily realities. Yet, despite such inhumane treatment, resistance endured, through sabotage, escape, revolts, and the preservation of culture. Britain's economy became deeply intertwined with this system, relying on slave labor to produce goods that fueled industrial development and wealth accumulation back home. As the 18th century progressed, a growing movement began to challenge the moral and economic foundations of slavery. Figures like Olaudah Equiano, who had been enslaved himself, published first-hand accounts that exposed the horrors of the trade. Activists like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson organized petitions, public lectures, and widespread grassroots campaigns. Their efforts led to the passing of the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, which banned the trade, and eventually the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, which ended slavery in most of the British Empire. Yet even in abolition, injustice continued. The government paid compensation not to the enslaved, but to the slave owners, over £20 million, equivalent to billions today, rewarding them for their loss of property. The economic benefits of slavery did not disappear with abolition. Profits made from the trade were reinvested into banks, railways, and factories, helping to build Britain's industrial infrastructure. Many elite families owed their wealth to slavery, creating a class system whose effects still linger today. Meanwhile, African societies were left ravaged, depopulated, destabilized, and stripped of generations of potential. In the Caribbean, former slaves were left landless and impoverished, forced into exploitative labor systems with little support for rebuilding their lives. Even today, the legacy of the British slave trade remains deeply embedded in British society, though not always consciously acknowledged. The controversies surrounding statues like those of Edward Colston in Bristol and Cecil Rhodes at Oxford University are not just about historical figures, they are flashpoints in a larger national reckoning. Colston, a prominent 17th-century slave trader, had long been honored as a philanthropist, despite the fact that his wealth came from human suffering. The toppling of his statue during Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 symbolized a collective demand to confront uncomfortable truths that have been long ignored or sanitized in public memory. These events have reignited debates about reparations, not just as financial compensation, but as a broader call for justice, recognition, and structural change. Activists and scholars argue that Britain has yet to fully account for how slavery financed its development and how its effects continue to manifest in racial inequalities. The institutions that were enriched by slavery, banks, universities, shipping companies, have often maintained prestige and power, while the descendants of enslaved people have inherited systemic disadvantages. This structural inequality is visible in various aspects of British life. In policing, people of African and Caribbean descent are more likely to be stopped and searched, arrested, or experience excessive force. In education, the curriculum often marginalizes or omits Black British history and the central role of slavery. In the British Empire, schools may cover the abolition movement but rarely explore the brutality of slavery itself or Britain's vast involvement in it. This selective teaching fosters a national amnesia, leaving younger generations without the tools to understand the roots of current racial disparities. Housing and employment statistics also show the lingering effects. Ethnic minorities, particularly Black Britons, are more likely to live in poorer housing, face discrimination in hiring, and earn lower wages. Health outcomes are similarly affected. Systemic factors such as access to care, environmental risks, and economic precarity contribute to higher rates of illness and mortality in Black communities. In this way, slavery is not merely a historical event, it is an ongoing influence. Its impact endures in the structures, attitudes, and imbalances that define contemporary British society. True reckoning requires more than removing statues, it demands confronting how the past shapes the present and rethinking what justice, Education and remembrance should look like in a modern, multicultural Britain. Reconciling with Britain's legacy of slavery and empire is a complex and uncomfortable journey, one that cannot be achieved through symbolic gestures or half-hearted acknowledgements alone. It requires a deep, sustained commitment to education, open dialogue, and meaningful structural change. The scars of the past are not buried, they're embedded in everyday life, shaping who holds power, who gets heard, and who is left behind. A historian's insight that we carry the past with us, whether we recognize it or not, is more than a poetic truth. It's a reality that plays out in policies, perceptions, and lived experiences across the country. To understand contemporary Britain, its wealth, its cities, its institutions, we must also understand the empire it once built, not only in terms of global dominance or economic expansion, but in terms of exploitation, brutality, and racial hierarchy. The prosperity generated by slavery enriched Britain's elite and laid the foundation for its modern infrastructure, yet the human cost, the lives lost, the cultures destroyed, the families torn apart, has rarely received equal attention in national narratives. History isn't something that lives solely in museum exhibits or dusty textbooks. It exists in the names of streets honoring slave traders, in statues standing in public squares, in old estates funded by plantation profits. It's in the generational trauma passed down through families whose ancestors were enslaved, and in the wealth passed down through those who owned them. It's in the classroom, where some children learn a sanitized version of the past, and in the justice system, where racial bias still echoes the ideologies that once justified slavery. Reconciling with this legacy means reimagining how Britain tells its story, not as a tale of unbroken greatness, but as a history that includes both innovation and injustice. It means listening to voices that have long been silenced, acknowledging the pain that still exists, and committing to policies that seek repair and equity. Only then can Britain begin to move forward with a clearer conscience, grounded not in nostalgia, but in truth.